I am going to go ahead and show you how to read patterns. So reading crochet patterns is kind of a separate skill from crocheting. I went many years without knowing how to read a crochet pattern when I first began. Obviously, if you have certain projects in mind, knowing how to read a crochet project or a crochet pattern is super important. But if you're like, I want to just like wing it and make a scarf, like you could pick any stitch you want and just make a scarf. But if you're trying to follow a specific pattern, you're going to want to know how to read patterns. So what I always recommend is to read through the pattern before you begin your project. And the reason why is because sometimes, not all the time, sometimes when you are looking at a crochet pattern, there'll be just like these little like hints or tips throughout the written pattern. And you can very easily miss those sometimes. So I always recommend to read through the pattern before you begin so that you are familiar with what is going to eventually come up with those patterns. So we're gonna go ahead and just start with the textured dishcloth first. And I'm just gonna kind of go through what I'm reading and what that means. So go ahead and look at the textured dishcloth pattern. It says that this dishcloth pattern uses the textured single crochet. Essentially, all you're doing is 2 single crochets in one stitch, skipping a stitch and doing 2 in the following stitch. Just repeat until the end of the row, turn and chain 1, then you do it all over again. So that's their little like note on the side. When you look at patterns, you will almost always see that there is a materials section, and it was going to tell you what kind of yarn to use, what kind of hook to use, if you need stitch markers, if you need a darning needle, if you need any other supplies, it will tell you right there under materials. So for the dishcloth, it says we need a skein of cotton yarn, which is the Lily's Sugaring Cream. That's just the brand. Underneath it says we need a 5mm or an H crochet hook, and then yarn needle to weave in the ends. A yarn needle is the same thing as a darning needle. They're exactly the same. And then there'll always be a section that says crochet stitches used. So for this one, you are going to do a chain, which is abbreviated to CH, and we're going to be doing single crochets, which is abbreviated to SC. Now, sometimes what I recommend too is after you go through this course, you are going to have knowledge of crochet terms and stitches that you previously didn't. So when you are first looking for a crochet project that you want to use your new skills for, it's always a good idea to look where it says crochet stitches used. Some patterns will even say that on the description before you purchase them. If you want to know what the stitches that are going to be used in the pattern, you can always reach out to the person who designed the pattern as well. And they will always be happy to say like, oh, like we use this stitch, this stitch, this stitch. But when you look at the crochet stitches used, when you're first learning, it's always good to check that section and say, okay, cool, I know how to do single crochets. Or if it said double crochets, like, oh, well, I know how to do that. That project might be a little bit easier for you versus something that has a whole bunch of different stitches that you've never heard of before, or you just like don't even like want to attempt something new. It's just kind of good to use that as a reference. Like, I know how to do chains. I know how to do single crochets. I'm pretty sure I can do this pattern. So that's the beginning part. And then the actual pattern here, it's pretty easy to read this one specifically, but it says the foundation, which is the very bottom of your project, we are going to chain 30. And then row 1, it says the second chain from the hook, single crochet all the way across. So remember when you see the SC, that stands for single crochet. Now row 2 through 28. So if you see a little dash in between these two numbers right here, you want to make sure that you are doing the same exact thing that's written on this line every single row until you get to row 28. So rows 2 through 28, we will chain 1, 2 single crochet in the first stitch, skip 1 stitch, 2 single crochets in the next stitch, and repeat until the last 2 stitches, skip 1 stitch, single crochet once in the last stitch, turn. Now, if you look at this pattern, you're going to know that there's these little asterisks here. Anytime you see these little asterisks, that usually means that this section right here between them is something that you are going to repeat multiple times. A lot of the times the pattern will specify how many times you have to repeat it. For us on this specific project, we are going to repeat this for every single row until we have 28 rows of our project done. And then row 29 here, it says chain 1, single crochet into the first stitch, single crochet across, fasten off, and weave in ends. So this one's a really basic, easy pattern to begin with because there's not too many variations. There's not too many steps to follow. It's just very straightforward, and it's a good way to get comfortable reading a pattern. So while you are crocheting, when you start your dishcloth pattern, I recommend referencing this even though you know the steps already. Like we already know that we're going to repeat rows 2 through 28 multiple times. So what I want you to do is every single row that you are doing, at least in the beginning, look at the pattern again and say like, okay, what does it say? Chain 1, 2 single crochets in the first stitch. There's those little asterisks. That means that we're going to repeat this entire step until we get to the very end. So skip 1 stitch, 2 single crochets in the next stitch, and repeat. So we go back to that, skip 1 stitch, 2 single crochets in the next stitch, repeat. And then you just keep doing that over and over again. You just keep repeating that little section over and over again. But like reading the pattern over and over while you're going along is going to help your memory like kind of retain what the abbreviations are as you're doing the things. It's going to help kind of like click a little bit easier. We will go over also how to read the granny square pattern next. All right, now we are going to look at the granny square pattern and kind of get familiar with how this one is worked up. So if you look at the very top here, it says that we need to know the abbreviations for chain, slip stitch, and double crochet. And then it's got the little asterisk there that says repeat. So that's kind of what they want us to know. These are the stitches that are involved. This one specifically doesn't say the stitches that are used, but you can see the abbreviations right there. It says the same thing. So I guess that's another thing to point out too, is some patterns will just have the abbreviations. And that's kind of all you need to know, because if you look at the abbreviations, it will always tell you the stitches that will be used there too. It might not be a separate little section. Like I had said before, it's always a good idea to kind of just like read through the pattern before you get started and then just begin. So if you look here, the sections are a little bit different. So we have round 1, which is the very center of your granny square, round 2, and that's going to be the second row essentially, and then round 3. So granny squares are worked in essentially 3 rows, or you can keep building onto them, but we don't want to overcomplicate things. So when you see here, it says round 1, it says chain 4, and it counts as a double crochet. So it's always good to recognize things like that. It's got the little brackets here, and those will just be a little extra note for why we're doing what we're doing. So the chain 4 counts as a double crochet, 2 double crochet in the 4th chain from the hook, chain, oh, and this is where the asterisks are, so we've got asterisks right here. So chain 3, 3 double crochets in the same space as the previous double crochet, repeat. So after you get to that part where it says repeat, we're just going to keep doing this little section here where we've got the chain 3, 3 double crochets in the same space as the previous double crochet, and you just repeat that until you have 4 clusters of 3 double crochet. Chain 3, slip stitch into the first set of double crochets to complete the first round. If you are changing colors, fasten off. So that's just how that one's written. Now the granny squares, the way that they're written for each row is very, very similar. So I'm only going to do round 2 to show you again how to read this pattern. And then if you reference the granny square video or the dishcloth video, I say the things out loud that we do every single time that we do it. So it's always good to kind of hear it, but then read it at the same time. So if you're following along, that's going to help you just kind of retain that knowledge of how to read the patterns. So for round 2, it says to chain 3. If you are changing colors, use your next color to create the chain. So we would use our new color for this one. 2 double crochets in the corner space. That's where we began our chain 3. Chain 3. 3 double crochets into the corner space. And then we've got asterisks here. So we've got an asterisk at the beginning here and then kind of towards the end of this line here. So this is the asterisk part. Chain 1, place 3 double crochets in the next corner space. Chain 3, 3 double crochets in the same corner space. Repeat. So you want to repeat this step multiple times until we have 8 clusters of 3 double crochets. Chain 1 and slip stitch into the chain 3 you created at the beginning of the round. If you are changing colors, fasten off. So obviously, like reading through it like this is way faster than physically making the product while you're following the pattern. In the beginning, it's always kind of nice to be able to print out a pattern and highlight each section as you go so that you don't accidentally repeat a section that you've already done. Or also, like if you put your project away and you're away from it for a week and you don't expect to be gone that long, when you return back to your pattern, you're gonna know where you left off because you've been highlighting as you've been finishing. So that's just a little trick that I like to do. If you are able to print a pattern, I just definitely recommend it. If you are looking at it on your phone, what you could do is just like screenshot it and maybe use the markup tool to just kind of highlight where you left off too, or make a note in your phone that says, I was on row 5, I just finished row 5, now I'm ready to do row 6 next time, you know, kind of plan for your future and like mark where you left off on a pattern, because if you end up repeating something, your pattern might not look the way that you wanted it to. So definitely try to keep track. You can even just do like a little mark next to each line as you go. Like you'll figure out what works best for you and your brain and the way to track everything as you go along. But it's pretty easy. I know that looking at patterns, and especially if you're brand new and you're like, I didn't even know what a double crochet is, don't stress about it. It's gonna be okay. Eventually it gets easier and easier. You'll eventually be able to look at patterns and be like, oh, this sounds fun. Oh yeah, I'm totally gonna do this. This sounds amazing. Or you might look at a pattern and be like, yeah, no, I'm not gonna take that on. That's too much for me. And that's also fine, because that still happens to me sometimes. Like sometimes you're just not mentally ready to take on a large project that requires a bunch of reading. But I hope that this has been helpful. Like I said before, always check to see the abbreviations or the stitches needed, and really just like read through those patterns. If you just skim it, that's okay, but you could miss some important details, like the little, you know, the bars where it's like counts as a double crochet. If you don't read that little section, you're gonna be like, I chained 4, but now like this doesn't make sense because my stitches are off, you know, like try to just really pay attention as you go along, especially while you're in the beginning phases of learning. Don't rush, just take your time, but take your time and just really get familiar with the patterns as you are learning how to crochet at the same time. But I hope that that's helpful, and I'm excited to take you onto this course.